RevOpsAF, the only podcast for people who are RevOpsAF and want to learn all about things that are RevOps AF.
Our goal is to give the revenue operations community, that includes marketing, sales, and CS, for any of you not paying attention, the skills needed to accelerate their careers. Hello, and welcome to RevOpsAF, the podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Camela Thompson, and today I am joined by Sarabeth Scott. Sarabeth, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started in RevOps.
Sure. Thanks for having me, by the way. Super excited to be able to have the opportunity to participate here. So thank you. I hate to say fell into it, but I mean, RevOps wasn't a thing when I first started down this path. And I am probably dating myself there, but I started my career in the finance accounting world. That's what my educational background was in, and went to a startup. Had the opportunity to move into a sales ops role, to which I said, that's like the opposite of who I've been working with and the teams that I've been doing, that supporting. And so I'd love to go learn more about that side of the business. And started in that role and immediately fell in love with it and loved working and just understanding how sales teams function, how they operate, what makes sales reps tick, all of those good things. And then took that finance planning side of things and was able to weave that in, obviously, into the role, leading budgeting and doing territory design and all the kind of things that startups do, usually with a very small set of resources. And as I did that and moved into that role, I spent a lot of time, because I felt like an imposter to some extent, because I was like, I haven't done sales, I haven't worked with these teams before, so I really need to learn them and do a lot of discovery and understand what they're facing in the field, and so I can better support them and support the business as a whole. And so that role evolved into, as I was there for 5 or 6 years before we got acquired, it moved into kind of an overarching kind of company ops role where we were doing some product operations, managing all of our KPI reporting outside of the financial statements, but so it gave me the kind of more of an end-to-end view, and I promise this is leading somewhere.
Oh no, this is all very relatable. Please keep going.
But it was such a good journey to get into just operations as a whole and kind of the precursor to what became RevOps a few years later. And so my path, I'm not going to go through my whole journey to where I am today, but it's been a little bit of a winding road, and purely because I've been a little bit opportunistic in kind of the different challenges that have come my way. And you either have a propensity to take a little risk and do those things because in the end, it gives you more exposure to things, and it just gives you more tools in your tool belt, as I eventually circled back to where my passion really is, which then was a full-blown revenue operations kind of function, and had the opportunity to join a couple of different tech companies at varying stages and lead the functions there. And yeah, so I have some perspectives on what those teams look like from small and growing scale-ups. So
I'm so excited to dig into that. But first, I just want to say I really appreciate your advice to say yes to different things and embrace the discomfort, because that is where we grow. So I think that's so great. That's how I got into marketing ops and CS ops and all over the place. And it just really gives you a wider lens to pull from.
It really does. And you don't even realize it at the time. But then when you have the opportunity to take a step back and you potentially go into something new, and it's like all of a sudden you start realizing that you're drawing on all this experience and all these things that you've picked up along the way, but honed into, and like the way that you internalize those experiences and then apply them is also unique to you and how you've learned. And the application of that really comes through in a kind of a philosophy, or I guess what's the word I'm looking for, but you have a perspective on, everybody has a perspective on what RevOps is and what it should be and what it should do. And I think there's a pretty wide aperture of that at the moment. And
there's a surprisingly wide aperture.
Yes. So yeah, the loaded question is always, what should RevOps look like? And what should the structure be? And And the answer wildly is it really depends, because it really does. It depends on the nature of what you're selling. It depends on the size of company and where the function reports and who the leaders are within that function. So there's nobody likes the "it depends" answer, but it's
I joke it's like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. There's the universal answer to all questions. And for revenue operations, it depends. It's the correct answer. So true.
This is true. This is true.
So
Yes.
I'd be curious to hear your experience, but in my experience, a lot of times smaller, scrappy, bootstrapped companies or startups, they don't always tend to think about revenue operations as an investment, and they often try to find somebody with some aptitude and shove them into the position, which is how, hey, I got started, and a lot of us
Same.
do. How should these companies be thinking about revenue operations? Let's start there.
For sure. And I think that tide is starting to turn a little bit. The more that there's so much content out there and there's so much being written and kind of posted and podcasted about in terms of the value that revenue operations brings to an organization. And so I think people are really starting to listen. And I think some of the go-to-market leaders that are coming up at the same time, right? These are people that were potentially ICs at a certain point in time. And as they evolve, and the function evolves, I think you're starting to see a little bit more of the aptitude to make the investment, because it is an investment. And the way I look at it is it's really a growth lever. It's a way to get more out of the resources that you have in place if you're leveraging the function as it should be. And I think that is the way that those kind of smaller companies should look at it, is instead of adding potentially more higher cost resources in the field, what could I potentially do to make an investment in the way that we operate, and being able to identify where the biggest opportunities are, because that's, at the end of the day, a big part of what RevOps should be doing, is helping companies identify where do you have the opportunities, what are additional growth levers that you could pull to get to that growth that you're really looking for, without just saying, let's add some more AEs, let's do this. But it's being about smart investments and making smart plays that are risk, but calculated risk to some extent.
I love all of that. So for companies that are bootstrapped, I think, and I'd just love to get your take on this, but I think a lot of people early to RevOps don't always realize that the CRM isn't really a selling tool. It is, but it's really where we get the data we need to make decisions as a business.
Yes.
So understanding both the data and how the configuration work together is super critical. So I usually advise people to bring in a seasoned consultant instead of relying on somebody who's super new to set up their instance so the data is structured correctly. Do you disagree or agree? And what other positions would you take in terms of advising, let's say, a founder of a startup?
Sure. I absolutely agree with you. The having expertise in how to structure a CRM system, because my whole thing is it starts with what is the strategy of the business effectively? What are we trying to accomplish? How are we going to execute that? What are the processes that then support that execution? And then how are we aligning our systems to support all of that, so that you can make sure that anything you're putting into place, you have the ability to pull the data to get to measurable outcomes, right? If the data structure is inherently not aligned to what you're trying to accomplish, you'll never be able to say we were successful or not successful. So it's like, how do you structure something that can evolve over multiple time horizons and over multiple kind of stages of a company's growth? And you can't get that from someone who's fairly new or hasn't been there, done that, seen it in multiple different businesses as a part of their kind of portfolio of, I've done this and I've done this. And it's the brilliance in being able to pick and choose what things are right for that sort of business to be able to implement and guide startups to me. So that investment I know I just went on for a long time about that, but I think that's one of the most critical investments you can make. because everything does really get underpinned by the CRM and how it's structured and how you can get data out of it.
And I think my other pet peeve, very related, is with marketing automation. You have to be so cautious to work with people who understand what should and shouldn't translate into the CRM and how that data should be structured so the sellers can best act on it and the executives can get the data they need, because how everybody views the world through the CRM is very different than marketing automation. So these are like the early days and a perfect opportunity to either set yourself up for future success or not.
100%. It's all of the integration points, right? It's like how, and that's where you have to really take a step back. And I think to answer the other part of your question initially, which is where else should you make the investment? I think whatever the resource is, maybe you have someone that's already a part of the company, but I think really defining and being thoughtful and forward thinking about what is the customer experience that you're trying to drive. And that should always be at the center of whatever you're defining. And all of your strategy and process and everything should obviously fall out of that, so that you can get to a place where you're driving a customer experience that is consistent all the way through. So whatever you're promising in the market from a marketing standpoint, from the first time that you engage with someone as a lead, you're able to live up to on the delivery side, from it, whether it's implementation, but then also to how they experience and how they're realizing the value of your solution. Because that, at the end of the day, if you're not maniacally focused on the customer value outcomes, then it'll be a long winding road.
Thank you. I've heard somebody argue that RevOps should solely be focused pretty much on sales, maybe marketing, but that sales is the only one that's revenue generating because they carry a number. And I just think to myself, as you mature, as you want to become a successful company, the vast majority of your revenue should be sitting with your customers. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. In an ideal world, I know the answer is always, it depends. It depends on how the company looks, but in an ideal world, like which departments should revenue operations support?
If you take that kind of my philosophy, there's that word again, but my stance is like RevOps should support the customer journey. Again, from the time you first engage with them until they are a happy renewing customer, and all the bits in between there. So ostensibly that's marketing operations. That's if you're large enough and you have a large enough ADR team or business development team, you have business development ops that's coordinating very heavily with marketing at the top of the funnel. And then that person is also sliding down and coordinating with the sales ops person. Granted, this is a big RevOps org, of which I have the complete joy of leading a team that we have the luxury of having ops resources that support most of these functions. We actually don't own marketing ops at the moment, but we pick it up from the time that we get to business development. But it's having that ability. We actually are adding technical, like pre-sales, post-sales, technical ops support, because we're finding that the interplay between, we have a highly technical product and it's a very complex sale. So pre-sales plays a big part of that. So it's unique to us or unique to some companies that have that sort of product. That's why I say it's really dependent on what you're selling. But yeah, I just shortened this answer to say, I think you have to have resources in ops. What RevOps should support is the customer journey. That's the long and short of it.
And so often I find that customer success is pretty neglected, and there are so many opportunities to optimize not only how we onboard the customer and the time to value, but also how we communicate that value. I think RevOps is in such a great position to help companies figure out how to see that value.
100%. And to articulate, and I think it's one of the hardest things is to get customers to communicate to you what are their objectives, one, and what's the value they're really seeking from the solution. And so that really does have to start up the funnel. But again, like it's got to be coordinated so that an AE is leading and driving a similar kind of discovery process through the sales process to help them. That's why they buy, right? There's a pain and they're looking for something to solve it. And there has to be value laced within that. And then at the back end of that, our CS team has to pick that up and ensure that focus remains, that we're still focused on driving that value. Here's what we found and articulated. And of course that evolves. And hopefully it evolves to the point where they see so much value that they continue to invest in the solution that you're bringing to them so that you can go to those relationships. But if you're not proving the value, everybody's talking about the name of the game is expansion, right? Grow your existing relationships. Unless you're really helping your customers realize that value, the expansion isn't there. And the other thing I always say is it's hard as heck to get new business in, right? It's a longer sales cycle. It's just harder. And the worst thing you can do is let those customers bleed out on the retention side.
And the best way to protect your growth is to ensure your existing customers are happy, because they're going to talk. Yes. So even I realize the early stage companies, they're still trying to figure out product market fit. They're still trying to figure out which messaging works. I totally understand the emphasis on go-to-market strategy and marketing and sales. However, that said, what I just referred to is so critical in figuring out how to retain and delight those customers.
Yes.
So important. So let's talk a bit about kind of the next stage in the evolution that I think about, which is more growth. We've established our ICP. We've figured out product market fit. What should those teams start to look like? And then let's start to talk about where they report to, because I think with early stage companies, it naturally falls all over the place. And here's where we could start to see a little bit of structure.
Yeah. I think if you're starting small, I think most companies start with sales. That's just the natural place. I need an ops person to help me figure out what the territory should be and getting equity across the board and making sure that we're taking advantage of the market opportunity and what is our total addressable market and all those things. And then I think marketing ops is also one of those that's where you add. And then because marketing ops is way more complex than I think a lot of people realize.
Yeah, I didn't until I moved from sales ops to marketing ops. And I'm like, this is why your data is so complicated.
Yes. All the attribution models and all the other things that go into it. And so I think, but then it's the big three, right? Everybody always defines RevOps as marketing, sales, and CS, right?
Not everybody.
Not everybody.
I'd like them to.
When I think about it, that's the trifecta that I think about, because then you're covering that whole customer journey, right? And as you grow, you just build within that and you're supporting. And as the functions grow, you grow there. I'm only really talking about the strategy and ops resources, though, because there's a whole other ancillary set of things that can fall into RevOps. Do you own systems or not? I have a deal desk function. Sometimes that sits in finance. Sometimes it sits in other places. So it all depends on how a company has defined it. And a lot, to be honest, the skill set of the person who's running that org. It is. And so that's why it comes back to that it depends answer. And the other thing is about the reporting line. So this is a question I get a lot. And most typically, I think, maybe not most typically, but for me, I've actually reported into 3 different places. One was into a CRO. I think that's probably the most traditional or common model. Again, it can depend on the skill set of that CRO. And I've reported into a COO. That was because he was very go-to-market oriented. And so he had that lens and he had the capability to do that. Currently, we do not have a CRO at Camunda. So we have an SVP of sales, an SVP of customer success, and an SVP of operations. And I report into the ops side. So twice in ops. It's never into finance, but that is another model that I have seen where RevOps reports into finance, the CFO.
I have. It's different.
Tell me more.
Okay, just from my experience, and there are exceptions to everything. So if you have a CFO who has empathy and is really understanding about how difficult everybody's jobs are and can combine that with the need for data. However, I found that more often than not, we're so hyper-focused on getting and collecting these data points that it is so easy, if you don't have a strong personality in revenue operations, to bog down your systems with validation rules and
Yes.
all of these things. So I know I've heard people say in a large organization, they have to own the data, blah, blah, blah. That's not necessarily true. I've worked for public companies who were perfectly secure with their data, and revenue operations still maintain the systems and analytics. So I don't know. I know there's a lot of people advocating for it right now. And I just, having sat in that seat, I've also reported into IT, and that was equally unsavory. But
I do know, because here's the role that I think RevOps really has to play is you really have to be objective.
Switzerland.
You have to be Switzerland, because there are times, I mean, compensation is a perfect example of where Switzerland comes into play, because finance will have a perspective. Obviously, the sales organization has a perspective. When you come into like a case by case, things that go to a compensation committee, for example, that's where you really need the objective voice to understand what is the right path here, what's the right thing for the business, and ultimately for the customer at the end of the day. And that has to be the lens at which you look at things through. And that's why I tend to like the alignment in operations, because it better fosters that more objective viewpoint. But I'm probably biased because that's where I've been.
I'm going to bias along with you, because hot take, see this CRO, I've seen it done well a couple times, but for the most part, to me, it's a failed experiment, because hear me out, if you spend a lot of time embedded in an organization, that's the organization you're going to have the most empathy towards, the most understanding about, and where you're going to dedicate the most time, because you know how to fix what's wrong. With operations, if you have somebody at the helm who's said yes to a lot of different things and experienced a lot of different systems and sat with a lot of different leaders in all the functions, then you have, I think, a better chance of achieving that objectivity.
I totally agree. I do. I think one of the reasons that I've stayed in this role and wanted to continue down this path is because I enjoy that objectivity. I really do. And I don't think you can become that trusted business partner that you need RevOps to be unless you can play that role, where you challenge people equally as much as you champion their ideas, and where you take a perspective that is a lot of time data driven. And to your point about data, like I have a whole data team, and which is awesome. Like it's a total luxury. And I know that's not true for a lot of companies. A lot of the times that's centralized as a BI team. And we may move in that direction as we get bigger, but what we do have is very specific go-to-market data analysts. We have some other people that support our product and marketing teams, but we have that resourcing so that we can look at it and drive insight, actionable insight. And then we leverage that.
And I love that, because it is so hard to find analysts who understand the nuances within each department or business objectives, why people are asking questions, what they actually want the answer to.
Yeah.
I just goosebumps, because I'm really happy you have that team.
It's so valuable, and they're so interwoven into everything that we do, really. Like we're obviously in heavy planning season, being able to serve up a question, and you don't just get a report thrown at you. You get, here's what I found. Here are some other things that we should dig into. Here's some questions I have for you, or the business. It's not just, hey, here's the data points you asked for. It's so much more than that. It's so much richer. And it leads to such a more productive conversation in the end with our stakeholders when we're working with them to define how are we going to structure our roles, our sales roles next year? Are we going to make sweeping changes? What's the strategy? How do we look at this? And based on what we're seeing historically, if we made this change directionally, how do we think that will impact? And so I think it's, I don't need to go on and on, but
I'm going to jump on this too, because I feel like it's so important. I think the greatest value revenue operations can bring to an organization it's not just getting the data. It's about asking the questions about why things are happening and trying to seek the context that we're missing. Because if we just look at the data, that's half the story. If we can get really curious, ask a lot of questions and start to see patterns over time, that's amazingly powerful. And that's where you get the efficiency. That's where efficiency comes from.
100%. I could give you a very detailed example, but right now we have a question that our head of sales asked in one of our QBRs. And it was about our MQLs are going up, but our SQOs didn't go up as much. So what's happening? A totally fair question. And it's led to a lot of digging and a lot of, whoa, okay, and a lot of discoveries and a lot of on both the marketing and the ADR side, to be honest.
Absolutely. It always is. It's never this one thing. I know that's what they always want. But there's always 5 different things that could be happening and probably are happening. Like, is the lead definition in alignment with the rest of your business? How's your qualification going? Are they covering things? Are they the right things being surfaced? There's so much.
There is so much. And to be honest, the best part of that is it leads to some self-reflection.
Yes.
Because it's like, oh, maybe we need to evolve our definitions of some of these things.
Yeah.
Because we're 40 million more in ARR than we were 2 years ago. And so maybe we need to, and I'm not saying we don't evolve our strategy more than every 2 years, but the point is like those sorts of things you got to kind of look at yourself in the mirror and say, whoa, okay, if this is the problem, then is it a behavior thing? Is it a fundamental definitional thing that we need to just take stock of and potentially reevaluate and change course, because we are changing strategy as a company. And so how does that really impact all the things that we've been operating on? So
yeah, ideally nothing is static, but we have so many other fires to put out that, it's hard to look at these things on a quarterly basis.
One of the outcomes was looking at our lead scoring, which we just completely rebuilt. Our marketing ops team did last year, about a little more than a year ago, and we're already in V2. They're launching a new lead score next year, because that's just the rate at which we need to take stock and reevaluate. And our ADR team is completely different than it was a year ago, and they're aligned differently.
The market.
And the market is totally different. That's exactly right. That is exactly right.
So this is a great segue into what advice would you give a VP of RevOps or somebody who really wants to get to that position? What are the things they should be doing to prepare themselves? Throwing a curveball. I didn't mean to.
I had a feeling this question was coming. I would say, and I always tell this to people when they ask me about my journey and all of this, and to be honest, I didn't really come to this until a few years ago when I started to reflect on what was my path here? And it's like I said, it was very winding, but the saying yes to things that don't necessarily, you don't have to be in RevOps your whole career. There are other opportunities that you can go do and explore and still come back, because that knowledge and that expertise and that skill set doesn't leave you. It just gets better with other things. So if you have an opportunity to go do something that will only broaden and enrich the skill set that you already have, do it. And then you can wind your way back and establish yourself. It is all about that objectivity and understanding, like how central RevOps is and where the value, how you articulate the value of the function. But you also need to be prepared for relationship management is one of the most critical aspects of this role. And that starts.
Amen.
Yes. That starts from the very beginning, is establishing those relationships with people. And ultimately, one of the things that I have been doing but didn't really realize it, and then thought about it, and I was like, oh, you lead people with you. You bring people along. And so you plant seeds of, hey, if you're thinking about making a change, or maybe we should look at this a little bit differently, or have you thought about it this way? And it's not, you can't just say, we need to do this, we should do this, we should do this. You have to bring people on that journey with you, because you may have arrived at a solution that you think is really awesome and that is really going to be a game changer. but you got to bring people on the journey with you on how you arrived. You didn't just wake up one day and say, oh, I have this great idea, but you got to bring people on that path. And by doing that, you build a lot of trust, you build a lot of rapport and that relationship. And then you establish yourself as someone has credibility and you're taking into account. If you're asking questions and doing all the discovery, that's the other thing. Discover, ask so many questions, don't make assumptions, really learn. If you're walking into a business for the first time, spend a lot of time understanding that business, understanding the product, understanding how it gets sold, so you understand all the nuances, and then you can start to offer.
That is such good advice, and it doesn't come naturally to most of us, self included.
It does not. It takes patience. It really does.
Yeah.
And you'll start to find that like in little ways, you can start to like interject. Well, and it's always drawing on past experience. In my past, here's how I've seen it. Here's an alternative way. Here's that sort of dynamic. But I think you just have to be prepared. The reason I brought up the relationship management thing is because stakeholders are hard. And sometimes you're going to encounter some folks that are very challenging to work with, but that's par for the course and it's what we do. And it's part of the challenge that I love is figuring out what motivates this person. And if you can figure that out, then you tailor your approach to that. And you have to be almost like a little bit of a chameleon in that way, because you might work with your CMO very differently than you work with your CRO, very differently than you work with your CFO. And the more that you can tailor that approach as a VP of RevOps, the better off you will be.
Absolutely. And I totally encourage people to look at the research. People are emotional decision makers, even the most data-driven in air quotes folks. It's more about how they feel than 100%. What you can. That can be hard for somebody who's super analytical to get. And I definitely fell into that. But once I figured it out, people are fascinating, and you should interact differently with a CFO than you do a VP of sales. It's
100%. They're two totally different styles and personalities. And there's a reason all of us choose a path to some extent, because it fits our intrinsic kind of personality. But no, I learned this the hard way. Don't get me wrong. I had to have some big heart-to-hearts with like, hey, you may be at the answer, but nobody else is. You got to slow your roll a little bit and get us caught
exact conversations with ex-managers. Thank you, old managers.
Yes, very much. Thank you to all of my mentors and former managers, because without them, a lot of this, everything I've said today would probably not be true.
Sarabeth, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. It's been a fantastic conversation. Where can people find you to network?
LinkedIn, of course. I'm in the RevOps community, the Revs Co-op community. So you can find me in those places. Am I missing anything? But mostly LinkedIn is where I generally house most of my networking. I don't know that I'm that different from anybody else, but thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and join the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode, everybody.
For more great content like this, join our community at RevOpsCoop.com and check out the links provided in the show notes.
Keep it RevOpsAF, y'all.